If America still believes in freedom, look into the eyes of a young soldier in Ouagadougou. I did not come to power to negotiate the price of our chains. I came to melt them.
That was the response of a 35-year-old African captain when handed an ultimatum signed by a former U.S. president. He had just 48 hours to hand over 60% of Burkina Faso's oil and gold or face sanction sabotage, and worse. They expected a signature. What they got was a storm. The letter didn't land in the hands of a client president. It landed in the war room of a man forged by dust, betrayal, and memory. A man who didn't fold. A people who didn't blink. A continent that has begun to rise not with fanfare, but with clarity. This is not a story about just one country. It's a mirror, a challenge, a blueprint. Because what if Africa refuses to kneel again? What if the lion doesn't roar, it simply stands? If you still believe in justice, not for one empire but for all peoples, then stay with us. Because what you're about to hear will not make it to the evening news. From dollars to drills. Why Burkina Faso became the target of a new empire. Burkina Faso is not the largest nation in Africa. It holds no seat at the G7. Its economy doesn't rattle Wall Street. But beneath its sun-scorched plains lies something far more dangerous to global powers than oil or gold. Sovereignty. And in a world ruled by resource maps and investment memos, that makes it a threat. For decades, Burkina Faso's subsoil remained uncharted, or so the world believed. But after a wave of military-led transitions in the Sahel, something shifted. Geologists under the new leadership, guided by the sovereign forces of the AES alliance, quietly launched a national survey. What they discovered wasn't rumor or speculation. It was seismic vast oil fields in the north and deeper veins of gold than ever publicly declared. But discovery alone isn't what triggered the storm. Control is. Burkina Faso didn't call Total Energies. It didn't invite Halliburton. Instead, it summoned engineers from Iran, radar teams from North Korea, and logistics specialists from Russia. These weren't just partners, they were chosen precisely because they came without colonial contracts or democracy conditions. Washington took notice. Satellites watched as strange cargo arrived in Ouagadougou. Drones mapped new roads in the Sahel. And when American intelligence flagged encrypted messages hinting at a petroleum corridor, African-owned, African-defended, the response wasn't dialogue. It was pressure. First came the quiet calls, World Bank warnings, IMF concerns, diplomatic whispers about instability. Then came the demand. A 7-page ultimatum wrapped in strategic jargon and veiled threats landed on the desk of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Signed by then-President Donald Trump. Stamped confidential. Its terms were clear: surrender 60% of oil and gold output, grant U.S. firms mining rights, and allow American oversight of all new energy contracts. In return, stability, investment, protection. But from what the message was clear between the lines from the same regime change machine that had haunted Libya, strangled Venezuela, and watched Gaddafi fall. Burkina Faso's wealth was never the real danger. Its independence was. And for the first time in decades, a country in West Africa looked at empire and said, "Not here, not again." The letter wasn't signed in ink. It was signed in arrogance. It began like every imperial demand of the past, polished, cloaked in business language, and delivered with the confidence of a superpower that had never been told no. But this wasn't 1960. This wasn't Mobutu's Congo or a post-coup Nigeria. This was the new Sahel, and the letter had landed on the wrong desk. The Strategic Resource Acquisition Framework, 7 pages long, arrived hand-delivered by a former U.S. military attaché, flanked by private contractors. Stamped confidential. It didn't ask questions. It issued instructions. 60% of Burkina Faso's projected oil output was to be allocated to U.S. energy giants for stabilization and infrastructure recovery. All gold export routes would be managed by U.S.-approved intermediaries. A Washington-led oversight board would have final say over any new contracts in mining drilling and development. In exchange, Burkina Faso would receive military cooperation security guarantees and protection from external disruptions. That last line said everything. It was regime change language veiled in polite punctuation. At the top of the document, in thick red ink, one handwritten note, "Traoré has 48 hours." It was not diplomacy. It was extortion wrapped in PowerPoint, and the man it targeted, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, didn't blink. He read the letter twice. Set it down. Then, with the calm of a soldier who knows both war and silence, he summoned his closest circle: intelligence chief, sovereignty force commander, legal strategists. No panic, just one order. Tell them Burkina Faso is not for sale. He didn't reply with a letter. He replied with action. Before nightfall, special units were deployed across oil zones. Communications with foreign contractors were cut. Gold transport routes were locked. And every well mine and reserve was placed under protection not by corporations, but by citizens in uniform. At dawn, the country awoke to a national broadcast. No teleprompters, no suits, just a soldier in uniform, one hand on the flag, the other holding the very letter they had sent. His words would ripple across generations. To the people of Burkina Faso, and to our African brothers and sisters, they gave us 48 hours to trade our sovereignty for security. To those behind this insult, Mr. Trump and your backers, you have misjudged us. We are not Libya. We are not Iraq. We are not your playground. He paused. The air stood still. You want our oil? You want our gold? Then you will face our dignity and our defiance. You now have 48 hours to take your greed, your arrogance, and your agents, and leave African soil. He saluted and walked off screen. No questions, no apologies, no retreat. What followed wasn't chaos. It was coordination. State media replayed the speech every hour. Volunteers lined up to defend mining regions. Women's cooperatives delivered food and supplies to border posts. Students painted murals in Ouagadougou, a lion rising over oil fields, the words, "Beneath we protect what's ours." Western embassies went quiet. The BBC ran emergency panels. CNN warned of instability. On Wall Street, oil analysts called for containment. But nothing could contain the fire Traoré had lit. Across Africa, the message rang clear: one nation's small, landlocked, long ignored, had just stood up to empire. And empire didn't know how to respond. Because the truth wasn't just in the speech. It was in the fact that he dared to make it. Washington assumed Traoré would fold. That fear would do its work. That the pressure of sanctions, smear campaigns, and internal sabotage would break him before the world even noticed. But they had underestimated, not just the man, they had underestimated the moment. For years, Africa had been rising quietly, building new alliances, unplugging from colonial currencies, studying the blueprints of Cuba, Vietnam, and Venezuela, and redrawing them with African ink. Burkina Faso wasn't a fluke. It was the first flare of a movement decades in the making. And when the world tried to force its hand, it didn't negotiate. It roared. They weren't just after the oil. They were after the blueprint. Burkina Faso wasn't supposed to matter, not to markets, not to militaries, not to global headlines. For decades, it was labeled poor, unstable, undeveloped. But now the satellites wouldn't stop circling. U.S. reconnaissance drones picked up unusual activity in the Sahel mobile drilling rigs without Western logos, encrypted supply routes from ports far outside NATO reach, and cargo manifests written in Cyrillic, Persian, and Mandarin. Something bigger was happening. Then came the leaks. A secret petroleum corridor stretching across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, funded not by the IMF, but by a new consortium, AES. This was the threat. Not a single oil field, not even the loss of access. The threat was structure. Burkina Faso, with no formal ties to the CFA franc, was building an entirely sovereign energy chain from exploration to extraction to export. Gold from renationalized mines was no longer routed through Paris. It flowed instead into a locally controlled development fund overseen not by Western auditors, but by military engineers and village councils. And the oil. It wasn't being counted in dollars. China had already offered a full-stack refinery built in 90 days, fully automated, fully Burkina owned. Russia brought in advanced electronic warfare systems, protecting the sites from drone surveillance and sabotage. More than that, they brought silence. No press conferences, no strings. But the real innovation, the one that lit alarm bells in Washington, London, and Brussels, was digital. Burkina Faso, alongside AES partners, was rolling out a gold-backed settlement system tied to the digital yuan, completely bypassing the CFA franc, the euro, and the US dollar. This wasn't just economic independence. This was monetary divorce. And that terrified them. Because if Burkina Faso could process refined value and sell its resources without asking permission from Paris or New York, what was to stop Mali from doing the same, or Chad or Congo? That's why the ultimatum came. It wasn't to claim what hadn't been built. It was to stop the idea before it matured. Kill the blueprint before the ink dries. But the ink had dried. And the people long dismissed as poor and powerless had already taken ownership. University lectures were now live streaming resource justice classes. Former miners, once employed by Canadian corporations, had formed cooperatives guarded by national defense forces. Even school children began learning about extraction chains, supply routes, and sovereignty in new curriculums rolled out by AES education officials. Traoré hadn't just said no. He had built a yes. Yes to infrastructure without IMF loans. Yes to energy without colonial signatures. Yes to sovereignty without apology. And as the cameras rolled in Ouagadougou across West Africa, another kind of camera was clicking, phone cameras held by students, workers, elders, capturing murals, speeches, protests, songs, capturing history as it was being written. Back in the West, panic set in. Fox News called it a Chinese trap. Bloomberg warned of Africa's drift toward authoritarianism. The U.S. State Department labeled the AES model unsustainable and risky. But the real risk wasn't for Africa. It was for empire. For the first time since the Berlin Conference, a bloc of African nations was not just rejecting outside rule, it was replacing it with its own system, a system with its own logic, its own currency, flows its own chain of command. They didn't fear Traoré because he had oil. They feared him because he had proof. Proof that Africa doesn't need to be managed. It needs to be trusted. Proof that resource wealth doesn't belong to hedge funds. It belongs to mothers, miners, and students. Proof that sovereignty is not just a slogan. It's a system. One that can be copied. That's why the response from Washington wasn't a debate. It was war by other means, digital sabotage, media distortion, psychological operations. Because if the truth spread, the paradigm might break. And in boardrooms from Manhattan to Geneva, that was the real emergency. Burkina Faso's answer wasn't just defiance. It was a declaration. We are not your extraction point. We are your example. If you touch Burkina Faso, you touch us all. When the world heard Ibrahim Traoré speak not with fear, but with fire, something ancient and unshakable stirred across Africa. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from dusty village radios to encrypted telegram threads in diaspora networks, the message echoed. We are done kneeling. But empires don't back down quietly. Within hours of Traoré's national broadcast, strange digital patterns lit up the Sahel. Internet speeds dropped. Social media accounts tied to the Burkina resistance began disappearing. False news stories flooded feeds, claims of coups, infighting, economic collapse. And then came the attacks on character. CNN described Traoré as erratic. The Economist ran a piece titled, Burkina Faso's Dangerous Turn. A Washington think tank called him the next African strongman. But the continent wasn't listening, because while the West spun its story, Africa was already writing a different one. Just days after the ultimatum expired, 3 military aircraft landed quietly at the Ouagadougou airstrip. No journalists, no translators, just brothers. Colonel Assimi Goïta from Mali, General Abdourahmane Chiani from Niger, Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya from Guinea. They entered the presidential palace side by side, and when they emerged, they stood with Traoré beneath the Burkina flag. If you touch Burkina Faso, Goïta declared, you touch us all. The message wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. Within hours, AES coordination centers went live. Mali sent hardened military advisors to oil zones. Niger activated satellite monitoring across the northern border. Guinea opened its airspace for emergency supply routes. Central African Republic pledged reserve troops. Chad, even under pressure, quietly dispatched observers. And it wasn't just soldiers who mobilized. This was a civilian uprising in the making. In Bamako University, students marched in support. In Conakry, murals of Traoré draped city walls. In Lagos, young Afrobeat artists dropped tracks with lyrics like, "We are the gold, they can't buy the soul." Diaspora Africans joined in. From Atlanta to Amsterdam, hashtags surged. "May ye Africa is not for sale." "Stand with Burkina, may ye Pan-African shield." In Nairobi, elders compared it to the Mau Mau resistance. In Harlem, black churches prayed for Traoré by name. This wasn't PR, it was memory. This wasn't trending, it was truth. The very existence of AES as an African security bloc, free from NATO and ECOWAS, became the world's newest geopolitical alarm bell. The West tried to call it militarization, but the people called it what it really was. Protection, finally, that didn't come with strings. And when the rumors of a second ultimatum began, Africa was already ahead. AES issued its own. Any attack on Burkina Faso would trigger immediate unified retaliation. Military, economic, and digital. This wasn't posturing. This was policy. The fire that Traoré lit wasn't just about defying Trump. It was about igniting a firewall for every African nation still haunted by extraction intervention and investments that left children poor and leaders rich. In response, Washington froze aid. The EU issued sanctions on Burkina officials, and media pundits warned of isolation. But inside Burkina Faso, something extraordinary was happening. The country wasn't collapsing. It was clarifying. More young people volunteered for oilfield security. Tech workers created offline file-sharing systems to bypass blackouts. Mothers organized food drives for soldiers and engineers alike. Local broadcasters aired lectures on Thomas Sankara Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba. And every time a smear piece aired on BBC Youth didn't argue. They remixed it into protest songs, graffiti TikToks. "If CNN hates you," one post read, "you must be doing something right." Because this was no longer just about gold or oil. This was about reclaiming narrative. And as the AES flag flew higher over air bases, convoys, and capitals, one thing became clear. The empire may still have weapons, but Africa now has something stronger. Each other. AES is not just a military alliance. It's a formula, and the formula is freedom. To the casual observer, the alliance of Sahel states AES might seem like a regional security pact hastily assembled to fill a power vacuum. But to those paying attention, especially within the corridors of empire, it is something far more dangerous, a replicable model. A blueprint for how post-colonial nations can unplug from the monetary chains of the CFA franc, from the diplomatic theater of ECOWAS, from the false choice between subjugation or chaos. AES, formed by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, did not wait for permission. It did not ask for funding from Brussels or blessings from Washington. It emerged out of war, betrayal, and necessity, forged in the fire of foreign coups, broken promises, and rigged partnerships. And now it is proving what no African bloc before It dared to declare security is sovereignty. Sovereignty is strategy. And strategy starts with self-reliance. The first layer of AES is what the West fears most: an African military coordination zone free of NATO oversight and hostile to foreign bases. Mali expelled French troops. Burkina Faso shut down U.S. surveillance programs. Niger kicked out EU trainers masquerading as advisors. But they didn't stop at rejection. They built joint logistics networks, standardized emergency protocols, formed a mutual defense pact. An attack on one is an attack on all. AES is no longer reactive. It is proactive. And every drone strike avoided, every convoy secured, is not just protection. It is a declaration of operational independence. For decades, Africa was told that sovereignty must wait until stability, until growth, until foreign investment. AES flipped the script. Burkina Faso nationalized its gold. Mali renegotiated mining contracts. Niger cut off uranium shipments, not benefiting the people. Then came monetary rebellion. Together, the alliance is laying the groundwork for a non-CFA-based economic corridor anchored in physical assets like gold and uranium, supported by digital infrastructure powered by Russian cybersecurity and Chinese blockchain architecture, and most crucially, traded through instruments that bypass the US dollar. This isn't theory, it's code, it's trade. It's happening now. Empires are no longer built by boots alone. They are built through narratives. AES understands that. So instead of hiring Western PR firms, they backed a digital media offensive fueled by young African creators, engineers, and historians. Fact-checkers now operate within AES information bureaus. Telegram networks outpace Twitter algorithms. Video essays exposing colonial resource theft go viral before BBC experts can respond. The youth don't wait for validation. They don't debate propaganda. They meme it, remix it, and bury it in truth, because they know the battlefield is now as much ideological as it is territorial. Here's what makes AES unique. It is neither West-aligned nor East-captured. It accepts support, but not submission. China provides refineries. Russia provides defense systems. Iran sends engineering teams. But the command structure stays African. The policy stays local. The vision stays Pan-African. AES isn't turning away from the world. It's choosing to meet it on equal terms, not as servants, not as subordinates, but as sovereigns. AES as a contagion of sovereignty. This is why the system fears AES, because it is not a closed club. It is a contagion. Already Guinea is aligning militarily. Chad is signaling coordination. The Central African Republic is adopting similar currency strategies. Even Ghana, long thought to be firmly embedded in IMF protocols, has begun internal talks on monetary resovereigntization. What began as a security pact has become a formula, and formulas can be taught, copied, scaled. If Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger can do it without ECOWAS, without Paris, without Washington, then who says Angola can't, or Uganda, or the Congo? What AES proves is that African freedom isn't a dream deferred. It is a system that can be implemented, a map that can be followed, a weapon that can be built from dignity, discipline, and design. The empire may still call it a threat, but history will call it a beginning. What would you do if it were your country? If a foreign president demanded 60% of your country's oil? If corporate giants drew up contracts for your land without your consent? If diplomats offered protection only if you gave up control of your gold, your future, your dignity? What would you do? Would you sign or would you stand? Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood, not because it was easy, not because he had overwhelming firepower, but because he understood something generations of colonized people have always known. It's not the size of your army, it's the clarity of your purpose. He looked empire in the face and said, "No more." And they called him dangerous. But ask yourself this, especially if you remember. Vietnam, remember COINTELPRO, remember Iraq, who gets labeled dangerous in a system built on domination. Burkina Faso has drawn a line. AES has built a wall. Africa is rising not with vengeance, but with vision. So we ask not just for support, we ask for recognition. Recognition that what's happening in the Sahel is not chaos, it is clarity. It is not rebellion, it is reclamation. If you once believed in justice, if you once questioned the wars fought in your name, then remember that instinct now. Because a young man with no billionaires, no lobbyists, no nukes, just conviction has just redrawn the map of power, and the world will never be the same.